It's summer 1907, and off the coast of Scotland, a brand new luxury liner ploughs its way through the gentle sea. This ship is a revolutionary step forward, the largest liner yet built in Britain by far. For 2 years, an army of workers has toiled long and hard to fill the cavernous hull with the finest luxuries ever seen at sea. Now, she's on her builder's trials in the Firth of Clyde. It's an important day. The ship is the biggest, yes, but she also has to be the fastest. Every part of her being has been constructed with speed in mind. If she can't hit 24 knots, then her builders will be penalised and the ship might prove an embarrassment. Representatives of the owners, the builders, and the Admiralty all gather on the bridge, and the wind rips at their bowler hats as the speed picks up. Now, she's moving all ahead full, her 4 propellers tearing through the ocean with furious intent. Like a long, thin knife, the liner cuts her way through the waves with ease. 20 knots, 21, 22. Can she hit the target? The men collectively hold their breaths and wait. Lusitania was the modern marvel of her time, an engineering wonder that combined all of the lessons learnt from decades of hard work and ingenuity. She became a household name for her beauty and her grace, and she carried tens of thousands in comfort and happiness across one of the world's largest oceans. But Lusitania would not be remembered for her luxury or her revolutionary design. Instead, this great ship's career would be virtually forgotten and overshadowed instead by horrific tragedy. In 1915, worlds collided when Lusitania, the marvel of her era, met another technological wonder that would change the course of history: the submarine. A series of unfortunate events would lead to a chance encounter that would leave hundreds dead, and one of the world's finest ships reduced to a rusting pile of wreckage on the sea floor.
Torpedo auf the starboard bow! 40. 55.
But how Lusitania came to be, and the path that led to her destruction, is one of the most incredible tales in modern history. That bright day in June 1907 saw Lusitania at her best, brand new and raring to show what she could do. Her turbine engines roared, the bow wave glowed white at her waterline. 22 knots, 23. Could she make the speed record? Lusitania sped on ahead and into the history books. May 1st, 1915, New York City, on a busy Saturday. The air hums with life. At Brush Stadium, the Yankees are demolishing the Philadelphia Athletics. Cars choke the city streets. Chauffeurs and taxi drivers drop off their passengers at the docks for a waiting steamer. In the New York Times, on page 19, after the stock reports and the real estate notices, varsity football news and baseball scores, readers could find the outgoing and incoming steamships, their destinations, and times of sailing. Individual lines posted advertisements, the big names like White Star Line, but sandwiched in between notices for the Anchor Line and the new Stockbridge Hotel was a conspicuous warning. Notice, it read. Travellers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. It's an obviously ominous message, and just a few lines above it could be found, printed in block letters, the name Lusitania, because she was due to steam out of New York Harbour that very day. Early in the morning that Saturday, Lusitania sat moored at Cunard Line's Pier 54, a steady stream of passengers boarding from gangways and finding their staterooms on board. Lusitania was going to steam her way through a war zone, and this was not one of Lusitania's normal sailings. Her captain was quizzed by newsmen on his confidence in being able to outrun his enemy. The newspaper notices had roused a huge amount of angst. Never mind, he had said, Lusitania could outrun any submarine. But his confidence couldn't shake the pall of concern that hung over the Chelsea piers that morning as passengers swarmed the decks to wave their final goodbyes and the Lusitania's whistles boomed out through the harbour. Some worried that this would be the great ship's last ever sight of New York. And they were right. Within the week, 3 in 5 of the beaming faces that lined Lusitania's railings would smile no more. But what ended as a tragedy had begun years earlier as a monumental triumph, and this berth at New York had been the scene of many a joyous homecoming, because there had once been a time when Lusitania was the finest ship in the world. In 1848, a curious-looking ship chugged its way into New York Harbour for the first time. Aptly named America, the ship carried a distinctive, tall, red smokestack with thin black bands, the telltale paint scheme of a shipping company that would one day become an empire. Samuel Cunard had founded his line in 1840 with ships that ran initially between Liverpool, Halifax, and Boston, and a few years later had come to dominate the transatlantic passenger trade. Mail contracts and government subsidies meant making a line between Liverpool and New York was a profitable venture for the company. The result was a quartet of purpose-built paddle ships, America as the class leader, and regular sailings into New York Harbour. It was the start of a relationship between Cunard Line and New York City that lasts to this day. But as the 1850s and 1860s wore on, competition emerged. Fierce competition. The White Star Line, the Inman Line, Germany's North German Lloyd, they all began to compete with Cunard, and it sparked the equivalent of an arms race, as every few years each line tried to outdo the others by introducing the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious ship. It was a game of tit for tat that would last well into the 20th century. Cunard had plenty of wins in this contest, but in 1897, Germany shocked the shipping world almost into stunned silence. North German Lloyd's SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse was the world's first so-called superliner. Distinctively, she carried 4 enormous, tall funnels. Almost overnight, virtually every other liner in the world looked second best by comparison. Now, this wasn't just a fun contest anymore. National pride was tied up in the development of these ships. They became floating billboards for their home nations, underscoring the development of the Oceanliner, a beautiful symbol of peace and prosperity had been the ugly development of weapons of war, torpedo boats, submarines, and mighty battleships. The major nations of the world stockpiled immense quantities of weapons never before properly used on the battlefield, machine guns, field artillery. It seemed inevitable that there would be a boiling point reached someday soon, but most hoped that cooler heads would prevail. Cunard Line's fleet was, in the early 1900s, being completely overshadowed by the German companies, particularly North German Lloyd, who followed up on their success with a trio of impressive sister ships for the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. For Cunard, this was a serious business threat. For Britain itself, it simply would not do. The British Admiralty knew they needed a horse in the race. Ships capable of great speed, that were the size of the German liners, had obvious military potential, but there was a problem. The White Star Line, originally a British company, had been bought by an American conglomerate. It left only one serious transatlantic player in British control, one horse in the race that the Admiralty could back to answer the German threat: Cunard Line. Cunard's chairman, Lord Inverclyde, was nothing if not a shrewd businessman. After taking over from his father, and over the course of 4 decades, he had successfully navigated the company into the modern era of shipbuilding, Now, with both his country's and his company's reputations at stake, he turned to the British government, appealing for investment towards a pair of liners that could outperform anything else afloat. The old agreements with the Admiralty ran deep with Cunard. The government naturally agreed, but under one condition. These proposed ships needed to be built to Admiralty specifications so that they could easily be repurposed into warships in the event of the outbreak of war. Inverclyde agreed, and history was about to be made. Under the agreement, Cunard was offered a vast loan and a yearly subsidy if the liners could maintain a maximum average speed of 24.5 knots and a minimum of 23.5. Just hitting those speeds wouldn't do. They needed to be easily maintained. As passenger-carrying ocean liners, it would make them the fastest ships in the world by far, but this would serve a vital role in a potential war effort. The simple installation of guns could transform these speed queens into vicious hunters, extremely difficult to catch. The papers were signed, and so it was that two of history's most famous and glamorous peacetime liners were designed with a secret purpose and war in mind. Work officially began on hull number 367 on June 16, 1904, when her keel was laid down at the John Brown & Co. shipyard in Scotland. When construction officially got underway, it was clear that almost every aspect of the ship's design could be summed up in one word: unprecedented. Immediate adjustments needed to be made within the shipyard to accommodate the liner's immensity. The slipway used for the ship's construction was the size of two smaller slipways from the previous generation combined. Adding to this was another unusual conundrum for engineers. The ship's 787-foot, 240-metre length was greater than the width of the River Clyde, where the shipyard was actually located, meaning she'd need to be launched diagonally, using the additional length afforded by a nearby tributary. Overseen by legendary naval architect Leonard Pesquet, engineers began to map out a ship with aggressively fine lines. Hitting and maintaining those required speeds was a tall order. The ship would need to prioritise speed above all else. Her plans show it. The hull was long and extremely fine, like a chisel. Pesquet's design teams tested models in an Admiralty tank and refined the stability. This was cutting-edge technology for the day. The ship's straight, plumb bow would mean the liner would cut its way through the worst of the Atlantic's towering waves, but the radical hull form would be useless without a suitably powerful engine to drive it forward. And fortunately, John Brown and the Cunard line had just the thing for it. The miracle machine was the Parsons turbine, an innovation in engine design that could easily outperform the older style of triple expansion steam engines that was popular at the time. Steam rushed through under pressure to turn a giant rotor and the ship's propellers. The new liner would have 4 main turbines, giving her a brute force of some 60 to 70,000 horsepower. It would need almost an unthinkable amount of steam to feed the turbines. 25 fire tube boilers lined the ship's bottom, fed by hand by hundreds of stokers who would need to shovel tons of coal around the clock to keep the ship roaring ahead. But the exact layout of this machinery, and how all those hundreds of tons of massive steel and iron equipment could even fit inside such a fine hull, was still being decided on. And not only that, but the Admiralty had their own ideas of how things should be arranged below the waterline. When constructing liners, it was typical for work on the hull to begin at both ends and then eventually meet in the middle. But in Lusitania's case, all work began at the bow. It left more time for the ship's engineers and machine workers to fine-tune the power plant that would be loaded into the ship's hull and would ultimately be responsible for her cracking speeds. The design process took 2 long years. In 1902, Pesquet's original concept showed a sleek ship with 3 enormous funnels, but by the time the power plant had been chosen, it was clear that more boilers were needed. More boilers meant another smokestack to clear the smoke. Yard number 367 would be a 4-funneled ship. On a clear, bright June day in 1906, after months of construction, the ship was at last ready for her launch. The sun beat down on her gleaming nameplate. There it spelt out Lusitania. It wasn't every day that the world's largest ocean liner took to the water for the first time, and almost every employee of John Brown & Co.'s shipyard was given the day off for the event, and passes were handed out to friends and family. Towering over their heads rose the bow of the largest ship ever built, seemingly touching the sky in its immensity. Lord Inverclyde had died before Lusitania's design could really get off the ground, but his wife, Lady Inverclyde, was there that day to launch the ship. With a crash, a bottle of champagne detonated against the steel-plated bow, and as a band performed Rule Britannia, Lusitania rumbled down the slipway which had been coated in tons of tallow and grease to ease her in. To the sounds of cheers and whistles, the hull floated for the very first time, a monument to engineering and human achievement. Now came the task of turning this empty hull into a working, living ship. 6 tugs came alongside Lusitania and towed her a few hundred feet down the Clyde River to her fitting out berth, where she would receive the bulk of the interior fixtures and furnishings that would rival most hotels on land, and the immensely powerful machinery that would make her the fastest ship on the ocean. For months, workers toiled, artisans carved, and labourers carted intricately detailed panels, and slowly the bare steel interior was clad with the finest decoration available. Electricians installed miles and miles of wiring, thousands of globes, call buttons, lifts, and motors. The immense boilers, the monstrous turbines, they were all lifted and sealed into the ship like the internal organs of some giant sea creature. Riveted on top were 4 towering smokestacks, each about as tall as most office buildings in New York City. With construction and fitting out complete, the ship would now need to undergo her sea trials. Lusitania was a unique case though. As Cunard's crown jewel, it was vital that all went according to plan. Any less than the best would be a serious blow to reputation. To account for this, the ship's first sea trials were actually performed somewhat in secret, so that if any problem arose, the ship's owners could make adjustments without attracting negative attention from the public and the press. On July 27, 1906, Lusitania made steam and surged ahead under her own power for the very first time. Joining the ship's crew were representatives from the shipyard, Cunard Line, the Board of Trade, and the British Admiralty. Both Cunard's reputation and British national pride were at stake, and the deal struck between Cunard and the Admiralty added an extra layer of pressure. If the liner did not meet her required speed of 24.5 knots as set by the Admiralty, the shipyard would face a penalty of £10,000 for every 1/10 of a knot below requirement, up to a total of £100,000, or $15 million in today's money. Slowly, the engines were worked up, the stokers poured the coal into the furnaces, and the turbines rumbled as all 4 propellers churned the water into violent white turmoil. 20 knots, then 21, 22, 23, 24.5 knots. Lusitania had done it. With the nimbleness of a steam yacht, she slipped through the water triumphantly, as if her 44,000-ton weight were a mere trifle. She had exceeded all expectations. Cunard and John Brown breathed a collective sigh of relief. But it wouldn't be all good news. The ship's powerful machinery and the arrangement of her propellers created a much dreaded problem. Interference between the wakes of the different sets of propellers was causing a shocking vibration which resonated with the stern and reverberated through the hull. It was passed directly into the passenger accommodations at the stern, a rattling so fierce that it clearly rendered the affected spaces, mostly second and third class accommodations, to be virtually unusable. Having been spared serious public scrutiny as a result of the trial's relative secrecy, Lusitania found herself at the Canada dry dock, where workers tried to address the problem. The fine, towering second-class dining saloon was ripped out and rebuilt with new bracing. Where there had previously been open space, columns now pierced the decks. The decor was reinstalled, and by the time the rebuild was completed, the rattling had diminished somewhat, but it would never be fully resolved. Lusitania would suffer from the issue for the rest of her career. Such was the price of technological innovation. On September 7th, 1907, after the initial trials were completed and after a short test voyage around Ireland, nearly 250,000 people lined the Mersey as the ship arrived at her home port, Liverpool, for the very first time. Tied up alongside, she absolutely dwarfed the landing stage, taking up the space 3 regularly sized steamers normally might. Under cover of darkness, Lusitania cast off from the landing stage at 9 p.m, bound for Queenstown, Ireland, and then the open ocean. Aboard her were around 2,200 people. The paint still smelled fresh, and much of the ornate crockery and cutlery had never yet served a meal. With a boom, Lusitania's voice echoed around Liverpool's skyline, and thousands of voices cried out in joy as she set off on her maiden voyage. Lusitania was finally going to do the job she'd been designed to do. Lusitania's first commander was Captain James B. Watt, and as he gazed down at his ship's mighty bows crashing through the waves, he must have been filled with an immense sense of pride. The ship's first stop had been Queenstown, Ireland, before she'd made a southwesterly course for the New World. Lusitania steamed lithely through the ocean, and she was proving to be every inch the speed demon she'd been cracked up to be. Approaching New York, the ship had steamed straight past the bewildered White Star liner Celtic, which had set off 2 days before her from Liverpool. Aboard the ship, passengers on the maiden voyage were immersed in a world of comfort and luxury few before had experienced. One look at Lusitania's sumptuous interiors, and you could see how she became an instant favourite, especially among society's elite. There was no shortage of luxury to be found on board, and it was very modern. From electric lighting throughout, as well as electric lifts, a clever form of air conditioning and heating by way of thermotanks, and the newest and finest in Marconi wireless telegraphy, Lusitania was truly a ship for a new age. Towering public rooms and entrances gave the ship a light and airy feeling. First class was naturally the most opulent and celebrated. The lavishly designed accommodations were the work of Scottish interior designer James Miller. They could be best described as palatial, a spectacle of airy plasterwork, high ceilings, and stunning stained glass. The Louis XVI style dining saloon could seat 470 passengers between its 2-story structure and was topped with an enormous dome that was adorned with decorative frescoes and hand-carved mouldings. The well-appointed lounge and music room was the most popular gathering spot for first class, and its breathtaking mahogany detailing, rich green carpet, and massive, 20-foot-high barrel-vaulted skylight crowned the room. It was made up of 12 different stained glass panels, each artfully depicting a different month of the year. At either end lay two magnificent green marble fireplaces, each 14 feet high. The room was especially attractive to female passengers who were known to pass the time on board with their noses firmly in a book, or excitedly writing letters and postcards home to friends and family. It also functioned as a well-stocked library where passengers could check out books for the duration of the voyage. Further aft, the first-class smoking room was a space tailored to the men on board, with darker, richer wood panelling and furnishings setting it in sharp contrast to the light and airy feel of the rest of the ship. Like other spaces, the smoking room was topped with a massive barrel-vaulted stained glass ceiling that served to brighten and open the room up. To help passengers get through the ship more comfortably, designers were faced with a problem. Sprawling, magnificent staircases had long been the norm on ships, and that worked fine if your vessel was only a few decks high, but liners like Lusitania towered 10 stories above the waterline. Electric passenger lifts fitted inside glass-encased, wrought iron cages ran up and down to ferry the passengers where they needed to go, another feature that marked Lusitania out as a ship of the future. For those looking to get some sun, located further aft on the boat deck, the Veranda Cafe, a room open at one end, was filled with light wicker furniture and palms with a skylight above. For those enjoying light refreshments inside, it was something like sitting on a veranda in the French Riviera. Of course, the luxury of the public rooms carried over into the passengers' accommodations. First class itself was almost segregated by the variety and sizes of the cabins available. Some were way down in the ship's hull, but at the top of the list, and for the small sum of just around $100,000 per crossing in today's money, first-class passengers travelling on Lusitania could be treated to one of the regal suites that came complete with 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a dining room, a private bathroom, a lavatory, and a pantry. This was Edwardian opulence at its most obscene. Second class on Lusitania was probably where the ship shined most in the market, because truly, to travel in second class aboard this ship was as good as travelling first class on any other liner. And it wasn't just hyperbole or exaggeration. Second class got its own towering dining saloon and palatial lounges. It had been a clever, calculated decision by Cunard. Instead of relying on the shipyard alone, they had broken with protocol by appointing the ship's interior designer, James Miller, to advise on how best to design second class as well. What resulted was a series of spacious, comfortable public spaces decorated in the same Georgian and Louis XVI styles that could be found in their first-class counterparts. Rich mahogany, airy plaster detailing, it was all on display here, offering a feeling of luxury unlike any other second-class space at sea. Unfortunately, as we know, these spaces suffered from a fatal flaw: vibration. The fix supplied by the shipyard saw many stabilizing beams and archways installed to reduce the vibrations, which the builders and designers tastefully disguised with wood paneling and gilt trim. In third class, passengers were treated to luxury akin to second class on other liners. Dining, smoking, and general rooms featured timber paneling. This in an era where most ships housed steerage in simple, white-painted steel compartments with exposed piping. Most impressively to passengers on board were flushing toilets. For many migrants, this would be their first encounter with such a novelty. So too with electric lights in all cabins. It's the kind of thing we take for granted today, but the simple presence of those features marked Lusitania out as a true wonder of her age. For a few halcyon days in that September crossing, passengers chatted happily, ate heartily, and relaxed as their fine ship sliced through the Atlantic at a breakneck clip. With New York fast approaching, whispers began to spread on board of the possibility of a record-breaking crossing on Lusitania's first try. Her speed had steadily increased each day throughout the journey, in the hopes of steaming into New York quickly enough to clinch the record for Britain once again from Germany, but it was not to be. The truth was that Watt had no intention of breaking the record that voyage. He had wanted to work his ship's engines up first. Even so, Lusitania missed breaking the German speed record by just 30 minutes. That was enough to make the North German Lloyd Line sweat. As Lusitania steamed past the Statue of Liberty for the first time, she was met with a welcoming committee of 200 vessels waiting to escort her to her berth. A massive flag bearing a message of welcome hung from the Singer building. Sirens were sounded, guns were fired into the air, and hundreds of thousands of onlookers crowded the piers. On her march to her berth, she slowly and gradually lowered her blue ensign as acknowledgement of the warm welcome she had been given. Despite the disappointment that the ship had failed to capture the speed record, Cunard officials assured the public that it was simply a matter of time. On her second voyage, Lusitania would prove herself in spades. She became the first liner to ever complete a transatlantic crossing in under 5 days, and she reclaimed the speed record for Great Britain. There was much celebration that evening in Lusitania's first-class dining room, with the ship's purser, Joseph Lancaster, offering a jaunty limerick which ran, "There was a young man in Westphalia who had charge of much costly regalia. To his sweetheart he said, 'My dear, when we're wed, we'll call our first girl Lusitania.'" North German Lloyd, on the other hand, was none too happy about this turn of events, jealously noting in the press that the Kaiser Wilhelm the Grosse had logged more miles on their crossings than Lusitania had on her maiden voyage, and that Lusitania had not exceeded the daily speed average of the German vessel. But she had broken the record that mattered, having made the crossing in an unheard of 4 days, 19 hours, and 52 minutes. Overnight, she became a household name, and the pride of her home nation, but more importantly than that, she was a happy ship. The golden years of Lusitania's career had begun. Lusitania's career was not without its eventful moments. Early on, the electrical fittings, such a wonder though they were, proved extremely troublesome, with bulbs blowing regularly and circuits shorting. The extreme fineness of the liner's hull also made for some curious behaviour. She was known to suddenly and alarmingly drop underfoot in even relatively calm seas, which could send unready passengers or stewards sprawling. Just 2 months after her maiden voyage, in late 1907, her semi-sister ship, Mauretania, joined her on the Liverpool to New York run. Both ships had been built by rival shipping firms to feed and benefit from the competitive spirit. They looked similar from the outside, but on the inside, where Lusitania was light, airy and elegant, Mauretania was dark, cozy and more classic. More importantly though, the new ship was fast. Mauretania beat Lusitania's speed record. Lusitania tried again in 1909 to wrest the title back from her sister when she had her original 3-bladed propellers replaced with new, more modern 4-bladed screws. She won the record back, but Mauretania beat her once again shortly after, and held the record for another 20 years. The real winner of this interfleet rivalry was Cunard, who could proudly boast the world's 2 largest and fastest liners. The towering red funnels of the ships became a regular and welcome sight in New York City, and in 1910 a massive new series of piers and sheds was built to help service the influx of enormous new liners. New York's iconic Chelsea piers were finished, and the Cunard ships at last had a terminal that matched their modernity. Then, in the winter of 1910, Lusitania was almost lost. A storm had battered the US East Coast, and it had proved fatal. Snowfall caused havoc, and the Atlantic was at its absolute worst. Less than 50 years prior, any ship caught in those conditions would be fighting for its very life, but Lusitania cut through the waves with relative ease, although even her famous speed had to be curtailed to do it. The ship had been built tough, with decades of modern maritime engineering expertise behind her, and she pressed on through the angry seas, with waves cresting over her deck and her superstructure with a thunderous din that was reminiscent of gunfire. Captain William Turner had slowed his ship down to around 16 knots in order to carefully traverse the storm, and the liner was handling herself adeptly, gracefully cresting wave after wave as they rolled towards her. But on this particular night, the ocean was looking to unleash its true fury. As Lusitania rode over the crest of one wave, her bow dipped down toward the water, just as a veritable wall of water some 70 or 80 feet high rose from the sea in front of her, blocking out even the sky. There was no avoiding it. It came crashing down onto the vessel with unimaginable force. Water violently washed over the decks down the entire length of the ship, burying her bow and superstructure beneath the surface. The crew stationed in the wheelhouse were were thrown against bulkheads, and the ship's wheel was actually ripped from the telemotor and hurled across the room, along with the quartermasters who were still holding onto it. Above their heads, on the compass platform above the bridge at the very top of the superstructure, a seaman was alarmed to find the enormous ship beneath his feet simply disappear into the ocean as white water swirled around his knees. Lusitania wasn't done though. She zoomed up out of the water with force, and she regained her trim. She had survived a brush with an extremely rare rogue wave. It hadn't been pretty. Lifeboats were smashed against the deck or torn off entirely, and the front of the bridge had been crushed by the force of the water, crumpling it back several inches. The bridge windows, nearly an inch thick, were all smashed. Davits were twisted like tin foil, doors were broken, bulkheads in the steward's quarters were bent. It took 15 minutes for the lights on board to be restored, and another 40 minutes before the ship could once again get underway. Miraculously, Lusitania survived this violent pummeling and was able to carefully navigate her way toward New York, battered and bruised, but ultimately still in good health. Her arrival, with bridge windows smashed and boarded up, run front page on New York's newspapers. The celebrity liner seemed to have cheated death, but sadly, time would soon show that she had merely delayed it. Life for Lusitania and her sister ship carried on with a regular happy routine. But then, in 1911, there came the long-anticipated answer from Cunard's old rivals. Olympic was put into service by the White Star Line that summer for her inaugural season. She dwarfed even the Lusitania. The Cunard sisters could no longer boast to be the largest pair of liners at sea because Olympic was going to get a sister ship soon as well. Lusitania was just departing when Olympic first docked in New York in 1911, and in an act of unusual bad faith, her commander didn't recognise Olympic, and Lusitania's whistles weren't sounded, nor were her flags lowered in salute. She simply left in jealous silence. The following years would prove more lively for the Cunard Greyhound. In early 1912, the schedule was changed for Lusitania and her sister. They would begin departing New York hours earlier than normal at 1 a.m, with Mauritania sailing on Mondays and Lusitania on Wednesdays. It would give passengers bound for Ireland plenty of time to disembark at Fishguard in Wales, where they could hop a ferry home, and then Lusitania could land her passengers at a reasonable hour in Liverpool. This was at the behest of the Irish Parliament, after Cunard had halted stops in Ireland during return trips. Eastbound, she still wouldn't call it Ireland, but at least this was a good compromise. Leaving at 1 a.m. might have seemed like a strange choice, but it proved surprisingly popular. The New York Times happily reported, in full sincerity, that it gave passengers time enough to attend the theatre beforehand. They stepped aboard about 11 p.m, still dressed in their theatre clothes. From then, until 1914, the 1 a.m. departure became Lusitania's routine. Then, in April of 1912, there came a monumental shock. Olympic's anticipated sister ship, Titanic, was introduced and lost on her maiden voyage. It was a huge blow to the transatlantic passenger trade as a whole. The scandal had been that Titanic should ever be allowed to go to sea with not nearly enough lifeboats for all on board. But the truth was that virtually all large passenger ships did the same. Lusitania was loaded with a small flotilla of lifeboats and collapsibles that would eventually provide space for 2,600 people. And then, in mid-1913, the ship began to experience problems with her vaunted turbines that resulted in her being pulled from service and refitted. By then, Lusitania wasn't the largest ship, nor the fastest ship in the world anymore, but she was arguably the most lovely. Her interiors still appealed. The wealthy and the well-travelled, they all flocked to her, and she and Mauritania did so well for Cunard that a third ship, Aquitania, was laid down for introduction in 1914. It all seemed to be going so well. But then, almost overnight, everything changed. The year Aquitania entered service, the tensions that had long been building between Britain, France, and Germany began to heighten. The boiling point was at last reached. On Sunday, August 2nd, 1914, Lusitania departed New York bound for Liverpool on her usual return home, but this would prove to be anything but a usual voyage. She left under a pall of uncertainty. The Austrian Archduke had been assassinated the week prior. Germany seemed poised to invade France at any moment in support of its allies. Diplomats frantically negotiated, and the newspapers and telegraphs ran with the latest news. Lusitania would need to make her usual scheduled crossing regardless of the outcome. 2 days into her voyage, alarming news finally came through on the ship's wireless set. It had happened. Britain had declared war on Germany. Lusitania was now a trophy to be hunted. Her passengers woke to find their ship being transformed. The gorgeous Cunard red funnels had been painted over in a dark grey, so too her brilliant white superstructure. Cunard, with its close Admiralty ties, had suspected that war was likely to break out on this voyage. They'd loaded her with stocks of grey paint just in case. The vessel was disguised so that she could blend into the Atlantic and make good her escape. The greyed-out Lusitania arrived in Liverpool a few days later, a bizarre sight given how drab she looked, but as it would happen, a few cans of grey paint were not the only preparations Cunard and the Admiralty had made for Lusitania in wartime, because the ship beneath the passengers' feet had a series of secret features which might have shocked them had they known. Admiralty involvement in Lusitania's design had been heavy from the start when they held the hull model tests at their tank, but then it manifested in other forms as well. Of course, the ship was designed to be very fast thanks to her turbines and her hull shape, but that wasn't all. Everything below the waterline had to be designed with warfare in mind. The Admiralty's grand plan was actually to convert ships like Lusitania and Mauretania into armed merchant cruisers, warships with guns designed to engage other cruisers or enemy merchant ships. Lusitania had been designed to actually engage enemy vessels in combat from the very beginning. The most obvious evidence of this can be found on her original deck plans. Obvious locations for 6-inch guns were marked out around the decks, and the mounting points for those guns were actually installed. Beyond that, though, was the ship's hull itself. Every consideration had been given to what might happen if Lusitania found herself in a gunfight with another ship. Her mechanical heart had to be protected at all costs. The Admiralty had stipulated that transverse coal bunkers had to run the length of the hull and provide a shield to the crucial boilers. Meanwhile, every major piece of machinery was to be housed well below the waterline where it might be protected from small caliber shellfire. The balanced rudder was designed to Navy standard. It impacted the shape of Lusitania's stern, which more resembled that of a cruiser or battleship. But crucially, the steering engine room with its emergency steering platform, complete with ship's helm and compass binnacle, was also located partly below the waterline. On many other ships of the era, the steering engines were often mounted much higher up. If Lusitania's bridge was shot away, the ship could be steered and operated almost entirely from this special compartment protected from enemy shells. This would be unlike any war the British Admiralty had ever fought, because they were facing, for the first time ever, a new and deadly foe. Germany had invested heavily in submarine technology. Their fleets of U-boats were well commanded and crewed and deadly efficient. At first, Britain seemed rather unconcerned by these newfangled machines, but this would soon change. On September 22nd, 1914, the German U-9 torpedoed and sank 3 British warships in one morning for the cost of hundreds of lives. This forced the British to recognise the U-boat for the existential threat that it truly was. If Germany could sink enough ships, Britain would starve. The outbreak of the Great War had unleashed hell upon Europe. Almost overnight, the passenger trade across the Atlantic ceased. The great liners of the world were mothballed while their owners waited to see what would happen next, and then, one by one, old agreements with the Admiralty began to be enacted, and ships were called up for service. Somewhat ironically, even though Lusitania and Mauretania had been designed with the conflict in mind, their immensely coal-hungry power plant kept the Admiralty from calling on them for service as armed merchant cruisers. They just consumed far too much coal, almost 900 tons of the stuff every day. The delay in calling the ships up for service was fortuitous because, in practice, liners actually made for terrible armed merchant cruisers. They were damaged and sunk in alarming numbers. The Cunard Carmania accidentally stumbled across the German liner Cap Trafalgar, which had been disguised, of all ships on the ocean, as the Carmania. Even though she was just fighting another ocean liner, Carmania was badly damaged in the conflict and almost sunk. The Admiralty had other plans for Lusitania. Instead of going into service as a warship, it was vital that a sea link between Great Britain and America still be maintained. Important diplomats and figures could get across the Atlantic in less than a week aboard the legendary Cunard ship. Speed was, after all, her most valuable asset. But crippling coal shortages meant there had to be concessions. Her average speed was reduced from 26 knots to around 21, which was still an impressive enough clip and quick enough to outrun any U-boat. At the time, no vessel making more than 14 knots had ever been successfully sunk by a submarine. On the morning of February 4th, 1915, another alarming message arrived aboard Lusitania while she was mid-ocean. Germany had enacted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. It meant that Germany had declared a war zone off the coast of Britain and Ireland. With the passing of this declaration, any British ship, be it merchant, passenger or otherwise, was considered a justified target of war. On Lusitania's bridge was Captain Daniel Dow, a Cunard veteran of some 4 decades. He took Germany's threats very seriously. The night before the ship arrived in Liverpool, Dow stayed on the bridge throughout the night, keeping a close watch for surface submarines and concocting a plan to hopefully keep his ship and her passengers safe from attack. He reasoned that as long as a torpedo did not cause an explosion in the boilers, Lusitania should live for about an hour after being hit. With this time frame in mind, he drew up a detailed plan to ensure all passengers could be safely carried off the ship in her lifeboats before she foundered. Dow also made the decision to fly the American flag, a flag of neutrality, on Lusitania's masthead during the final day of her voyage, a move which would prove very controversial and carry serious implications for the conventions of naval warfare. If Dow's strategy was to pass Lusitania off as an American ship, it probably would not have been very effective since Lusitania was one of the most recognizable vessels afloat, and America had no 4 funneled liners of her own. Regardless, when the ship docked, the Liverpool landing stage erupted with reporters eager to know the reasoning behind the usage of this kind of false flag. Captain Dow assured the press that there was no subterfuge intended. He was merely signaling the presence of neutral American passengers crossing on his vessel. An American journalist reporting on the whole affair, though, wrote that Britannia not only ruled the waves, but also waived the rules. After the false flag incident in Liverpool, Dow completed one last crossing on Lusitania before stepping down as the ship's master. He was no longer able to justify the stress of operating a ship that had been marked as a justified target of war in an enemy war zone while likely transporting contraband across the Atlantic. Dow had spent 5 wartime voyages commanding Lusitania, and on each one he was known to scarcely leave the bridge, hardly eating or sleeping, keeping a constant watch for submarines. Eventually, he developed stomach ulcers thanks to the stress and the lack of proper nourishment. Cunard approved his request for sick leave, and command of Lusitania was handed back over to Captain William Turner. Meanwhile, Captain Dow's actions had caused a ripple effect that found its way to a very unamused Germany. The Germans, of course, had not taken kindly to Britain's clever loophole. Members of the press insisted that a British ship flying the flag of a neutral country should be illegal, and that the practice left no way for German U-boats to discern between neutral and non-neutral ships. On the war front, the Imperial German Navy gradually continued upping the ante over the months that followed in response to what they saw as Britain's attempt to skirt the conventions of war. By the May of 1915, the gloves were off. Germany now had its sights directly on British passenger vessels, and they were very clear about their intentions. Previously, a submarine would engage an enemy merchant ship by first surfacing, forcing it to stop, surrender, and evacuate before then sinking it in an orderly fashion. The U-boat crews had been horrified when their prey began to fight back, sometimes with guns and even with attempts at ramming. Lusitania's false flag may have been one of the final straws. Now German U-boats could attack unseen at any time from below the surface. The German ambassador to America, Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff, had personally decided that his home nation's submarine campaign was, in his opinion, probably illegal, and actually doing damage to Germany's reputation and relations with the USA. He didn't think Lusitania could be targeted. To do so would be an obvious diplomatic misstep of enormous proportions, but even so, he decided to act. A warning was drafted and sent from the German embassy in Washington to the major newspapers in New York, and so it was, on May 1st, 1915, as Lusitania's boilers simmered away quietly and steam was gradually got up for the impending departure, that the New York Times ran that warning on page 19, sandwiched in between the notices for the anchor line and the new Stockbridge Hotel. Saturday morning. Lusitania lies alongside the Chelsea piers, all her coal aboard and the final cargoes being loaded. A steady stream of passengers crowd the gangways and sheds, passing inspections and customs. Before their eyes, the sheer hull of Lusitania rose up like the face of a huge steel cliff. She must have seemed so vast and so safe. The German embassy's warning had not gone totally unheeded. There'd actually been a few cancellations as the more nervous passengers had backed out, but those hundreds and hundreds who boarded the Lusitania on May 1st, 1915 had either missed the warning entirely or simply assumed that no civilized country would ever attack an unarmed merchant vessel carrying neutral passengers, especially not the Lusitania, a ship whose breakneck speeds were thought by most to make her virtually impervious to attack by a U-boat. Reporters flooded the dock that morning amidst the flurry of activity. Because of the newspaper warnings, this voyage in particular had drawn deep public interest and concern. Reporters even managed to corner Captain Turner, asking him his thoughts on the situation. He replied, "Do you think all of these people would be booking passage on board the Lusitania if they thought she could be caught by a German submarine? Why, it's the best joke I've heard in many days, this talk of torpedoing." He burst into a hearty laugh and added, "Germany can concentrate her entire fleet of submarines on our track, and we would elude them." To Turner, Lusitania was the ship used to cheating death. She had taken the Atlantic head-on and won. She had sped through the Atlantic dodging U-boats for months. His ship was the most suited to this important job, and he wouldn't have any suggestions to the contrary. News cameramen weren't so sure. One set up even on top of the Chelsea piers and began to roll his camera as Lusitania was backed out slowly past. Down on the docks, photographers snapped away for the newspapers and jokingly announced, to all within earshot, "We're going to call this one the Lusitania's last voyage." It was to be the liner's 202nd transatlantic trip, and tragically, the bad photographer's joke was going to prove prophetic. Kinsale Lighthouse. It looks out over the Celtic Sea from its perch above windswept green hills and ragged cliffs. It's a place of particular beauty and danger. In the old days, ships were driven onto the rocks in storms, but that May, in 1915, there was another danger present, lurking just below the water's surface. Standing in the lee of the great black and white tower, a man peers out into the distance and sees what he makes out to be a ship. Not an unfamiliar sight from Kinsale, where the great Cunarders make their first landfall after days spent on the Atlantic. Lusitania, her funnels darkened, is just hours away from home and safety. Her crew and passengers can see Kinsale and the Irish coast, but this is as close as Lusitania will ever get to her home again.